Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. This is a talk on Liber 65, where the full title is the Book of the Heart Girt with the Serpent. Liber 65 is one of the most enigmatic texts in Crowley's body of writing, and it's among the most difficult to interpret. If we read it as poetry alone, it becomes beautiful but vague. If we read it as doctrine alone, it becomes formulaic and mechanical. If we read it only as biography, it contracts into Crowley's private experience. And yet the text itself refuses all of these reductions. It feels like something more is stirring beneath the surface. Its images behave less like doctrinal statements and more like parables, which are compact, symbolic dramas that transmit spiritual knowledge subtly through myth, reversal, beauty, terror, irony, and shock. In that sense, Liber 65 is composed in what medieval alchemists call the language of the birds, a symbolic form of text in which truth is not laid out directly, but concealed within vivid, surreal imagery that must be explored actively and deciphered by the reader. Crowley himself suggests that these images should not be taken merely as poetry. They function as teaching devices. But the teaching is far more than purely intellectual. The images are meant to provoke recognition, to create shifts in consciousness rather than simply communicate ideas, just like an initiation. All right, so let's get a quick show of hands. How many of you have read Liber 65? Okay, most of you. And how many of you would say you're familiar with the text in the sense that you've read it recently or you have a general idea of what the book contains? A little less. And has anyone really studied the text, like deeply? All right. The book itself is laid out in these in 5 chapters, and each chapter has 65 verses. The verses are of varying length, and the whole text itself is basically just big blocks of text. And you can see this is one of the pages of it. You can tell, got my new laser pointer. So it's got the actual verse numbers, but the text itself just flows together. There's no real dividing marks or anything like that. So the verses themselves are mixed jumbles of stories and symbols, poetry, and no real coherent structure can be easily discerned. The narratives in the text sometimes can be really condensed. Sometimes it can just be one little line as a story. Sometimes the stories will go over a number of the verses, and sometimes there'll be a little bit of a story that pops up throughout the book, but you don't really know when something new is starting or when something ends. So here you can see this is the selection I made of just 2 verses, and this contains a whole parable in of itself. Now, there's no real dividing line. There's no way to know this is where one starts or where this is, where one ends. It's all based on interpretation. So tonight, we're going to be working with a small series of selections from the book that I've pulled out and I've designated as individual parables. Each one, I believe, can be read as a standalone narrative, and I give them titles just to make it a little bit more easy to work with. When I first started studying the book, I made a motif manual for myself, and I listed each of the parables that I thought were kind of a standalone piece, with the verse numbers, and then as I started going along, I cross-referenced those where I saw, something kind of is arising, it's come up again. And this little motif manual I made is where this talk really began. There's over 8,000 words in the book, and the parables I've selected for tonight are about 13% of the overall text. So what I'm offering is not a total reading of Liber 65, it's a deliberately selective pathway through it. It's a beginning of a way to work with the text. It's not an exhaustive exploration. Now, obviously, in 75 minutes, we don't really have time to go through the whole thing. So my claim tonight is that certain parables in Liber 65 are not merely isolated poetic images. They can be read as stages within a coherent initiatory arc. When approached in sequence, they appear to trace a movement of consciousness from the instability of ordinary perception through the recognition of psychological projections into the awakening of aspiration, and onward through the crisis of the rational mind towards forms of awareness that are increasingly unified and ultimately non-dual in character. This does not imply that the text presents a fixed or mechanical map, nor that it encodes a single system to be applied uniformly. Rather, it suggests that the symbolic sequences within the text may reflect recurring transformations in experience, patterns that can be recognized but not rigidly imposed. In Kabbalistic terms, the movement can be read as aligning with the vertical current of the tree of life along the middle pillar, beginning in the fragmentation of Malkuth, passing through the reflective and imaginal fields of Yesod, awakening in the solar center of Tiferet, confronting the limits of the Ruach, and in some sense crossing the abyss toward a more unified mode of awareness. The parables in this light function not only as symbolic representations, but as descriptions of psychic events, shifts that unfold within consciousness itself as part of a graduated process of transformation. Before we begin, I must state that I am indebted to a number of prior readers of Liber 65, especially, of course, Aleister Crowley's own commentary, IAO 131, and the interpretive framing developed by our peers in the Thelemic world. I especially want to thank IAO 131 and his little book, The Parables and Lessons of Liber 65, which was one of the texts that got me started on my own quest, and which I follow in this presentation. This talk, however, is not an attempt to just flatten all of these voices into a single system. It is an effort to explore one coherent arc within Liber 65 without sacrificing its multiplicity, because multiplicity is one of the main defining features of the book.
I am the heart, and the snake is entwined about the invisible core of the mind. Rise, O my snake, it is now is the hour of the hooded and holy ineffable flower. Rise, O my snake, into brilliance of bloom, on the corpse of Osiris afloat in the tomb. O heart of my mother, my sister, mine own, thou art given to Nile, to the terror Typhon. Ah, me, but the glory of ravening storm ensuades thee, and wraps thee in frenzy of form. Be still, O my soul, that the spell may dissolve, as the wands are upraised and the eons revolve. Behold, in my beauty how joyous thou art, O snake that caresses the crown of mine heart. Behold, we are one, and the tempest of years goes down to the dusk, and the beetle appears. O beetle, the drone of thy dolorous note be ever the trance of this tremulous throat. I await the awakening, the summons on high from the Lord Adonai, from the Lord Adonai.
This obviously is the first verse from the text, and this verse, along with the title itself, The Heart Girt with the Serpent, can be seen as a microcosm of the entire text, containing its compressed form and the themes that unfold throughout the book. The heart girt with a serpent is not just one symbol among others. It's a fundamental polarity. It suggests that the whole work turns on a hidden center of consciousness wound about with dynamic force. If we read it in that light, the serpent becomes the transforming current that moves throughout the entire book, disturbing appearances, exposing projections, awakening longing, and ultimately dissolving the boundaries of the separate self. The heart can be read as the center, the point of awareness, the witnessing consciousness, and the seat of love, intelligence, and identity. The serpent can be read as the dynamic, awakening force, kundalini, life current, the world wrapped around the point, home of intuitive wisdom, interaction, and transformation. Together, they imply not a static doctrine, but a center of experience encircled by potency, a nucleus and an electron, hadit and nuit. Much of the text can be fruitfully read within that polarity. This image also invites comparison with tantric accounts of the very subtle mind abiding in the heart center. My point is not that Crowley cryptically was writing about Tantra, but that both systems figure decisive transformation as taking place through a center in which awareness and force are joined in the heart. Liber 65 repeatedly returns to states in which beauty, longing, terror, and identity collapse toward an inward axis. The heart serpent image provides the vocabulary for that entire movement. Just as in Greek epic literature, the opening verse should not be treated as a decorative preface. It contains the whole drama in seed form. The serpent must rise. Beauty blooms on a corpse. Storm wraps the soul in a frenzy of form. Stillness dissolves that spell. Beetle and trance announce transformation. Adonai is awaited from above. The text already begins knowing that the initiation is not a linear process of self-improvement. It is death, beauty, fear, grace, and union all at once. If the opening image contains the drama of the whole book in seed form, the next question is whether the drama unfolds in any recognizable structure. So most commentaries treat Liber 65 as simply a collection of devotional poetry. My claim here tonight is that it can be read as concealing a middle pillar formula describing the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, and ultimately a pathway toward non-dual realization. When certain parables peppered throughout the text are read together, they map suggestively onto the same vertical current up the tree of life, describing how consciousness moves from ordinary perception to total awakening. This formula is laid out most concisely in 2 verses near the beginning of the text.
One mounteth unto the crown by the moon, and by the sun, and by the arrow, and by the foundation, and by the dark home of the stars from the black earth. Not otherwise may ye reach unto the smooth point.
So this phrase can be read as offering a compressed instruction on the pathway from Kether to Malkuth along the middle pillar, which the initiate then travels in reverse. Black earth corresponds naturally to Malkuth. The dark home of the stars corresponds to the universe, the path of Tao. Foundation is Yesod. The arrow corresponds to the archer Sagittarius, the Tarot Atu Art, the path of Salmak. The sun is Tiphareth. The moon is the high priestess, the path of Gimel. And the smooth point is Nekuda Pashuta, the single point, Kether. In other words, the classic ascent of the middle pillar. And Crowley says, not otherwise may ye reach unto the smooth point, which gives us the sequence, a strong point of purpose. This path is being presented as the way to arrive at the intended goal. Now this phrase, the smooth point, is capitalized in the text, and it translates to Nekuda Pashuta in Hebrew. It is a term in Lurianic Kabbalah describing a primordial point of emanation. It can be understood as referring to the first emanation of the divine out of the Ein Sof. It is the infinite potential that exists above and before the tree manifests. In this reading, it functions as Kether, the crown, a concentrated point of origin from which multiplicity unfolds. This hidden formula does not appear to be merely a random hermetic insight thrown into the book. Instead, it suggests that the parables may function not as isolated poetic images, but as stations in an ascent. They describe how consciousness moves upward through the central current, first awakening from the apparent solidity of the world, then confronting psychic projection, then turning toward a solar center, then passing beyond the sufficiency of the rational and conceptual mind, and finally opening toward ecstatic and supernal modes of consciousness. Seen in this light, Liber 65 begins to look less like devotional poetry and more as an initiatory manual disguised as song. Crowley's Class A holy books rarely teach by straightforward exposition. They trigger, destabilize, seduce, invert, and finally illuminate. Their truth is activated rather than merely explained. One has to study strenuously until one discovers the hidden meaning for oneself. In that sense, it is similar to what a well-trained therapist understands. Giving a patient the answer does not produce real insight. The patient has to follow the clues that lead them toward self-discovery. That aha moment is what produces transformation and makes an actual shift in consciousness. So this formula offers a compelling lens through which the structure of the manuscript could be read. When the central parables that I've selected for tonight are arranged in sequence, they can be read as suggesting a coherent initiatory progression that follows this formula. What's more, each image does not simply advance the path, it overturns the psychological certainty established by the previous stage. Crowley arranges the symbols so that each level of mind becomes insufficient in turn. The naive, complacent realism of the world gives way to the discovery of projections. Projections give way to longing. Longing ripens into ordeal, and conceptual mastery dissolves into silence. In that way, the text does not merely describe initiation, it dismantles the successive structure of mind through which the aspirant interprets the path. There's a similar process in the way that Tibetans teach advanced philosophy, where one studies and masters a particular way of looking at the world. Then, a new system is introduced that exposes the flaws of the previous perspective. This new view is explored and mastered, and then yet another, even more subtle philosophy is introduced that shows how the previous perspective simply cannot operate effectively. Gradually, one's understanding becomes increasingly subtle, sublime, and nuanced. The parables in Liber 65 function like stations along the path, each marking a transformation in how consciousness experiences itself and the world. When placed in sequence, they can be read as revealing a coherent initiatory progression that begins with the destabilization of appearances and culminates in a loosening of separate identity and a wider feel of awakened being. Crowley's symbolism is thelemic and Kabbalistic, but the developmental arc converges suggestively with several other traditions. When we step back from these different languages of initiation, the sequence closely resembles a familiar alchemical process of transformation, a pattern that also appears in the Buddhist contemplative frameworks of Mahamudra and Madhyamaka, and also in Jung's account of individuation. Students of Western Hermetic schools may also notice that this sequence bears a strong resemblance to the structure of the AA and GD initiatory paths, in which the aspirant moves from the mundane, ordinary perception through the purification of the psyche toward the realization of the holy guardian angel, and then eventually across the abyss and beyond the limits of the rational mind. Interestingly, when we look at contemplative traditions that examine consciousness deeply, we often find remarkably similar sequences of transformation. Before we continue, I want to briefly clarify two Buddhist traditions that will appear as comparative lenses throughout this talk, Madhyamaka and Mahamudra. So Madhyamaka, or middle way from the Sanskrit, is a philosophical approach that one inevitably encounters in all of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions. It is a rigorous and analytical system that examines experience and argues that phenomena do not possess inherent, independent existence. Things appear solid and discrete, but closer examination reveals them to be relational, contingent, and empty of fixed essence. Its analysis of relationality and contingency bears a striking philosophical resonance with certain insights in modern science, such as relativity. Mahamudra, by contrast, is a Buddhist contemplative meditation tradition. It approaches these insights through direct yogic meditative observation rather than intellectual philosophical analysis. In Mahamudra practice, the practitioner learns to examine the mind itself, watching thoughts, perceptions, and emotions as they arise and dissolve in awareness. Through this direct observation, one notices that mental events are fleeting and insubstantial, appearing within a wider field of awareness that is open, clear, and not confined to any particular thought or experience. In that respect, Mahamudra has certain similarities to Zen, which also emphasizes direct insight into the nature of the mind through contemplative observation rather than philosophical argument. Dzogchen is another Tibetan Buddhist contemplative system that, in its own way, works directly with experience rather than primarily through philosophical analysis. Rather than constructing a theory about reality, Mahamudra gradually reveals, through meditation, awareness is experienced as spacious, luminous, and less confined by the fixed boundaries that ordinary thinking tends to impose. So Madhyamaka clarifies the mode of existence of phenomena through reason, while Mahamudra investigates the nature of awareness in direct experience. Taken together as a comparative lens, these two perspectives help illuminate a graduated sequence of awakening in which appearances lose their naive solidity, the mind's projections become visible, and awareness progressively recognizes its own open, non-dual nature. Interestingly, when we step back from the imagery of Liber 65, we will see that the parables we examine tonight follow a strikingly similar progression. The four alchemical patterns hidden in the book begin with dissolution, or nigredo, the blackening phase, where the apparent solidity of the world and doctrines breaks apart. Then separation, or albedo, the whitening phase, where projection becomes visible and events are distinguished from interpretations. Then conjunction, or citrinitas, the yellowing phase, where aspiration awakens and the soul encounters the deeper center. And finally, coagulation, or rubedo, the reddening phase, where consciousness stabilizes in a new arrangement beyond the old egoic structures. The phases we examine tonight follow the same alchemical sequence, and the sequence begins with a surprisingly philosophical problem, the instability of perception itself. So now we're going to start exploring the parables and how they relate to the journey up the tree of life. In our first section of parables, we'll begin with the alchemical phase of dissolution, nigredo, the breaking of appearances. And this first parable under discussion is what I call the light and colors. This is our entry up the middle pillar of the tree of life.
Adonai spake unto V, saying, there must ever be a division in the word, for the colors are many, but the light is one. Therefore thou writest that which is of mother of emerald, and of lapis lazuli, and of turquoise, and of alexandrite. Another writeth the words of topaz, and of deep amethyst, and of gray sapphire, and of deep sapphire with a tinge as of blood. Therefore, do ye fret yourselves because of this? Be not contented with the image. I, who am the image of an image, says this. Debate not of the image, saying, beyond, beyond. One mounted unto the crown by the moon, and by the sun, and by the arrow, and by the foundation, and by the dark home of the stars from the black earth. Not otherwise may ye reach unto the smooth point.
So this first parable in the analysis presents the metaphysical problem of subjective perception. The light is one, but the colors are many. Different systems, doctrines, and revelations may appear contradictory because each refracts a single underlying reality through a different medium. The instruction is not to cling to the image, not argue endlessly over symbols, but to pass beyond them toward the source itself. On the tree of life, this belongs to Malkuth, and to the first stirring up the middle pillar. In Malkuth, reality appears fractured into separate, independent things. One lives among myriad forms and mistakes independent identities for the final, ultimate way things are. The first crisis in ordinary consciousness comes when one realizes that appearance is not equivalent to essence. Different people see the exact same event and interpret it differently. That destabilization matters because it shatters naive realism. The seeker no longer assumes that the world is simply given exactly as it seems. Under a Mahamudra lens, this same parable marks the beginning of contemplative intelligence. One begins to see that what presents itself as solid reality is already a reduced, interpreted reality. Perception is not neutral in a simple sense. Categories, language, doctrines, and expectations act as lenses that stand between us and the light. So the parable is not merely saying we need to be tolerant of each other's perspective, that we each have our own valid subjective experience. Instead, it's teaching the aspirant that the first obstacle is over-identification with one's own angle of refraction. Our view is merely one facet of a complex gem. The colors are many because the light is one. Diversity of perception does not abolish truth. It reveals that truth exceeds any single symbolic interpretation. Kabbalistically, this is the first crack in the hypnosis of Malkuth. The world of separate forms begins to reveal itself as a divided and flattened expression of a deeper unity above. That is why this parable is the proper beginning of the path. It produces a crucial philosophical humility. Awareness of the limitations of one's own experience makes one capable of generating aspiration. It makes one capable of wanting to experience more. Here, we give rise to hunger for the pure light. In Tree of Life terms, consciousness begins here to turn away from the shattered surfaces of the kingdom toward the vertical current of return to the origin, the crown. So now we're going to do our first meditation. Take a moment, get comfortable, or more comfortable than you were. And you can close your eyes if you want to, or just let them unfocus. Take a few breaths. And notice whatever is present in your experience, whether it's sensations in the body, sounds in the room, or the movement of your breath. For a moment, allow everything to be exactly as it is. Be here now. Nothing needs to be added or removed. Just remain present with what appears, without labeling, interpreting, or generating opinions about it. Be here now. Okay, you can return. In the language of mystical traditions, this is the beginning of recognition, the mind discovering that experience unfolds spontaneously. This first parable destabilizes naive realism. The next one goes further by showing that the instability of the previous realism is not only philosophical, it's psychological. So from Malkuth, we ascend via the path of Tao, which is the universe card in Crowley's Thoth Trail. And here we enter Yesod. This movement is reflected in the parable of the petal of Amaranth.
Thou seest yon petal of amaranth, blown by the wind from the low, sweet brows of Hathor. That falling petal seemed to the little ones a wave to engulf their continent. So they will reproach thy servant, saying, Who had sent thee to save us? He will be sore distressed. So this second parable intensifies the first by moving from doctrine to lived experience. A petal falls gently. To the adept, it is beautiful. To the tiny creatures below, the exact same event appears catastrophic, a wave threatening to destroy the whole world. This lesson is severe. Meaning is not inherent in the event itself. Meaning arises through scale, subjective position, personal history and conditioning, and even karmic interpretation. This is why the parable belongs naturally to Yesod, the Sephira of the subconscious. Yesod is precisely the sphere in which image, history, dream, and emotional coloring present the world that we think we are directly and accurately perceiving, even if it is from our own personal perspective. Once the aspirant sees that a subjective perspective governs and distorts experience, spirituality stops being merely a matter of ideas. It becomes a matter of psychic purification. One has to begin asking not only what is happening, but how is my own mind manufacturing the experience I believe I am perceiving? How can I move to a perception that is closer to what is actually happening and away from my own bias? One of the key processes that emotionally charges our experience is what we call projection, and it operates constantly, shaping the world each of us inhabits. Projections offer a breadcrumb trail to the subtle interior world that we carry, the ways that we may recreate those patterns in subsequent experience. We often project unresolved psychic contents onto fresh situations through defensive or compensatory mechanisms, and then mistake the resulting distortions for reality. By observing our projections, we can infer the complexes buried in our own psyche and begin to untangle them through difficult but deeply rewarding self-inquiry. Crowley's own remarks sharpen this parable beyond a soft lesson in subjectivity. Here, Crowley says that the Redeemer is resented because his action appears destructive, and may indeed be destructive in relation to the forms that can no longer remain. If a new house is to be built, the old one must first be demolished. That is crucial. The petal is not only a parable of perspective, it can also be read as a parable of spiritual annihilation in the service of creation. Liberation is experienced by obsolete structures as catastrophe, as they say in Serbian. He likes the Serbian pronunciation.
Here, the psychological strand of the text really becomes clear. Resistance does not arise only in society, which misunderstands the adept, but it also arises in the ego of the initiate. The ordinary self experiences deeper truths as invasion, humiliation, threat, or loss of status. The lower structure does not want illumination, if illumination means its destruction.
The scribe was wroth thereat. He spake, O Adonai and my master, I have borne the inkhorn and pen without pay, in order that I might search this river of Amrit, and sail thereon as one of ye. This I demand for my fee, that I partake of the echo of your kisses.
This is why the petal opens directly in the lines following this passage into one of the most honest motifs in the book, the scribe demanding wages. The mind will eventually serve, but not selflessly. It bargains. It wants reward, relief, attainment, recognition. So now let's do the second meditation. Once again, get comfortable. Take a few deep breaths. When a thought arises, ask quietly, where did this come from? When it fades, where does it go? Who is the one that perceives these thoughts? Is the mind something solid, something you can locate? Or is it more like an open space in which thoughts appear and disappear? Ask again. When you hear a thought, who is hearing it? And you can open your eyes again. Once projections become visible, another problem appears. The mind cannot help but construct ideals. So from here, we'll enter the second phase of alchemy, separation. This is the phase where we distinguish the image from reality. And in this ascent up the tree of life, we now take the path of Samak, which is the art card in the Thoth deck. This is the pathway connecting Yesod to Tiferath. The moment here is represented by the parable of the river, the boat, and the golden woman.
Moreover, I beheld a vision of a river. There was a little boat thereon, and in it under purple sails was a golden woman, an image of Asi wrought in finest gold. Also the river was of blood, and the boat of shining steel. Then I loved her, and losing my girdle, cast myself into the stream. I gathered myself into the little boat, and for many days and nights did I love her, burning beautiful incense before her. Yea, I gave her of the flower of my youth, but she stirred not. Only by my kisses I defiled her, so that she turned to blackness before me. Yet I worshipped her, and gave her of the flower of my youth. Also it came to pass that thereby she sickened and corrupted before me. Almost I cast myself into the stream. Then at the end appointed her body was whiter than the milk of the stars, and her lips red and warm as the sunset, and her life of a white heat like the heat of the midmost sun. Then rose she up from the abyss of ages of sleep, and her body embraced me. Altogether I melted into her beauty and was glad. The river also became the river of Amrit, and the little boat was the chariot of the flesh, and the sails thereof the blood of the heart that beareth me, that beareth me. O serpent woman of the stars, I, even I, have fashioned thee from a pale image of fine gold.
The river, the little boat, and the golden woman form one of the richest symbolic clusters in the book. Crowley identifies the key terms directly. The river is the stream of thought, the boat is consciousness, and the woman is the ideal enthroned within it. In Kabbalistic terms, the image first appears as a reflected form, but its function is to draw consciousness toward the hidden realization at the center. At first, the woman appears only as an image, decorative, pale, and without vitality. Through sustained devotion, however, the image does not remain stable. It darkens, distorts, and becomes almost unbearable as the psyche's own contents are brought into contact with it. Yet it is precisely through this tension that something begins to shift. With persistence, the image no longer functions merely as an object of projection, but begins to take on the quality of lived presence. This does not mean that fantasy becomes literal fact. What was initially encountered imaginatively becomes existentially operative and transformative. In that sense, the movement from a yesodic image to a Tifereth realization can be understood as a transition from reflected symbol to inwardly realized experience. The attribution of this process to the path of art is therefore especially fitting, as it captures the gradual refinement and transformation through which the image is not discarded, but transmuted into something living. The sequence describes how spiritual ideals often unfold in practice. They begin as images. They become distorted through psyche and ordeal, and only through persistence can they begin to become living contact. There's also something important here about attachment to pleasure and novelty. Pure aspiration has to persist through the apparent boredom, the darkening, the restless, short attention span, the period in which the image no longer feels exciting or beautiful. The phrase, "the pale image," captures that intermediate stage very well. Spiritual life does not begin with possession of truth, but with the crude likeness not yet fully vital. And the task is neither to worship the image forever, nor to reject it when it darkens or becomes dull. The task is to persevere through that phase until it becomes inwardly alive. When that ideal is no longer experienced merely as projection, but as something inwardly alive, the path begins to turn from psychic construction toward genuine aspiration. And so now we're going to continue with the alchemical process and move into the conjunction, the meeting of soul and the deeper center. Our next parable, which I call Persephone and Hades, can be read as representing an experience associated with Tifereth.
There was a maiden that strayed among the corn and sighed, then grew a new birth, a narcissus, and therein she forgot her sighing and her loneliness. Even instantly rode Hades heavily upon her and ravished her away.
Once the initiate begins to see how perception is shaped by projection, and how truth may be approached through sustained engagement rather than immediate certainty, the path does not culminate in skepticism or analysis. Something deeper begins to stir. As appearances lose their unquestioned solidity, a space opens in which longing for what is real can arise. What may have first appeared only as an image, sustained through effort and devotion, begins to take on the character of something more immediate and compelling. It is precisely at this moment that the symbolic language of Liber 65 shifts from refinement of perception to encounter. The text expresses this transition through the mythic pattern of Persephone's descent. In this imagery, the movement is not gradual self-improvement, but an abrupt reorientation of the center of identity. The maiden, situated within the ordinary rhythms of life, is suddenly drawn away into an underworld that represents a deeper, less accessible dimension of experience. The Eleusinian tradition, which preserves this myth in ritual form, was not described by ancient sources as a philosophical teaching, but rather as a transformative revelation, an encounter that altered one's understanding of life and death. Whatever the precise mechanisms of the rite, its significance lies in the structure of the experience, a descent, an encounter, and a return with altered vision. And this is Lana and I at Eleusis in Greece. This is Lana right here at the mouth of the underworld where Hades came out and actually took Persephone away. The Eleusinian mysteries drew participants from across the Greek and Roman worlds, and later traditions associated figures such as Plato and Marcus Aurelius with the sacred drama of descent and return. In this light, Hades can be read as representing a force within the psyche that draws consciousness inward toward its own depths, something analogous in thelemic terms to the holy guardian angel, not as a literal equivalence, but as a parallel function within an initiatory process. The key point is that initiation here is not self-directed in the ordinary sense. It is experienced as interruption. The structures that previously organized identity are displaced, and the individual is drawn into a process that cannot be fully controlled or predicted. Kabbalistically, this corresponds to the awakening of Tifereth, where the center of identity begins to shift away from the surface personality toward a deeper organizing principle. From a Jungian perspective, this may be understood as the ego encountering the self, not as an abstract concept, but as a living center that begins to reorganize the psyche. In this way, the descent of Persephone becomes not merely a mythological reference, but a particularly precise symbolic articulation of a turning point in the path, the moment at which aspiration becomes encounter, and the path is no longer something one follows, but something that begins to act upon the individual. I'm going to do a third meditation here. So again, get yourself comfortable. Take a few breaths. And allow thoughts, images, and emotions to simply arise naturally. Instead of following these thoughts, watch what happens if you do nothing with them. A thought appears. If it is not grasped, it dissolves on its own. Another thought appears, and it dissolves. Another thought arises and dissolves. But the witness, the one watching the thoughts, does not change. And you can open your eyes again. This process is what many contemplative traditions point to. Thoughts do not have to be destroyed. They naturally dissipate when they're not grasped. It's called allowing thoughts to self-liberate. Awareness is not reducible to any single thought. The awakening of aspiration immediately produces a new obstacle. The rational mind trying to understand what must instead be lived. So we move on to the fourth and final of the alchemical phases, coagulation. stabilization in higher consciousness. Our journey continues up the pathway, which crosses the abyss, the path of Gimel, the priestess, connecting Tiferet to Kether, and the supernal trio of Sephirah. This first parable, the reaper and the wise man, represents the approach to the abyss, the first half of the journey the priestess makes.
Thou knowest the white, and thou knowest the black, and thou knowest that these are one, but why seekest thou the knowledge of their equivalence? And he said, that my work may be right. And Adonai said, the strong brown reaper swept his swath and rejoiced. The wise man counted his muscles and pondered and understood not and was sad. Reap thou and rejoice.
So by the time we've reached this reaper and wise man parable, the crisis of the initiate has become explicit. Here, one man harvests joyfully, the other analyzes his muscles, calculates the mechanics of labor, and becomes sad. The first reaps, the second does not. The problem is not reason in the abstract. The problem is analysis that substitutes itself for participation, and in doing so, it produces inhibition. This is why the parable belongs to the threshold where conceptual mastery fails, the approach of the abyss. It marks the limit of the intellect. It clarifies, discriminates, compares, organizes, and protects. But it cannot substitute for realization. It cannot reap the harvest of complete awakening. At a certain stage, excessive interpretation becomes a refusal to act, and reflective intelligence curdles into impotence. In contemplative traditions, this is the familiar moment when one realizes that thought cannot think its way into the nature of awareness. Analytical insight may prepare the field, but it cannot replace direct recognition. Here, we can understand the role of the Zen koan, a paradoxical statement or question used to exhaust the logical mind and provoke direct insight, frustrating the rational intellect with something it cannot resolve. A deeper intuition must arise in order to proceed. Crowley himself warned that the mind is a good servant but a bad master, and this parable expresses that principle with ruthless clarity. The reaper stands for aligned action or will in motion. The wise man stands for the paralysis that follows when the conceptual mind forgets its subordinate role. So the Kabbalistic issue here is not whether the mind is clever, but whether it has yielded to the central current instead of trying to replace it. The moral is ruthless because it has to be. The parable pushes the point to an extreme. Do the work joyously, rather than becoming trapped in reflective incapacity. One set of ideas is as good as another, unless will is actually being done. In Kabbalistic terms, this marks the limit of the Ruach at the threshold of the abyss. The analytical mind can clarify the path up to a point, but it cannot cross the gulf between conceptual understanding and realization. We can see here that the power of the intuitive high priestess, the Atu representing the journey from Tiferet and the second order across the abyss to Kether and the supernal trio of the third order. At this boundary, the aspirant has to relinquish the compulsion to master experience through explanation and instead yield to the current of will itself. The reaper, therefore, represents the last healthy expression of the Ruach, action aligned with the work, rather than reflection about the work. Only when the paralysis of analysis is relinquished can consciousness move into the next phase, the symbolized by the swan, an awareness that moves freely across the abyss without the need for conceptual orientation. When analysis finally exhausts itself, consciousness begins to move in another way altogether. So the journey of the priestess from Tiferet, crossing the abyss into the supernal triad of Binah, Chochmah, and Kether moves forward with our next parable, the white swan.
Also the Holy One came upon me, and I beheld a white swan floating in the blue. Between its wings I sate, and the eons fled away. Then the swan flew and dived and soared, yet no whither we went. A little crazy boy that rode with me spake unto the swan and said, Who art thou that dost float and fly, and dive and soar in the inane? Behold, these many eons have passed. Whence camest thou? Whither wilt thou go? And laughing I chid him, saying, No whence, no whither. The swan being silent, he answered, Then, if with no goal, why this eternal journey? And I laid my head against the head of the swan, and laughed, saying, Is there not joy ineffable in this aimless winging? Is there not weariness and impatience for who would attain to some goal? And the swan was ever silent. Ah, but we floated in the infinite abyss. Joy, joy, white swan, bear thou ever me up between thy wings.
The white swan gliding through infinite blue space is one of the most beautiful images in Liber 65, and also one of the most layered. The little boy asks the questions ordinary reason always asks. Where did you come from? Where are you going? And the adept answers, in effect, no whence, no whither. The swan moves, but not toward a goal. It moves in joy, suggesting a Zen-like state in which the intellect has taken its proper subordinate role. This parable marks a decisive shift. If the previous stage marks the exhaustion of the Ruach, this one hints at consciousness moving above its ordinary compulsions into a more liberated current. Once conceptual mastery loosens, consciousness can be experienced not as a problem-solving apparatus, but as a mode of effortless, self-manifesting presence. The crazy boy cannot understand emotion without destination, because the rational mind is structured around cause, purpose, and linear sequence. But the swan belongs to another register. It presents existence as a form of ecstasy no longer organized by ordinary conceptual demands. The image also resonates with Indian and Tantric symbolism of Hamsa. In Sanskrit, Hamsa literally means swan or goose, but spiritually it symbolizes the soul, the divine spirit, and breath. It represents purity, discernment, through the mythic ability of the swan to separate milk from water, and spiritual liberation. It is often associated with deities like Saraswati, who we see here. In yogic tradition, the swan is attributed to pure consciousness, discriminating wisdom, and freedom of movement across states. That resonates with the idea of a liberated mode of awareness that exceeds discursive intellect. The realized sage is a Paramahamsa, the supreme swan. In yogic language, the swan also evokes the natural mantra of the breath, Hamsa, or Soham, I am that. This mantra expresses the union of Shiva and Shakti, or Brahman and his power. It is said to arise spontaneously with breathing. Hum accompanies the exhalation of prana, and Sa, the inhalation. Because it is inseparable from the breath itself, it is regarded as a supreme mantra for meditation. When attention rests steadily on this rhythm, the mind is no longer carried away by discursive thought, and it begins to purify, a necessary condition for self-realization. And when we reverse this mantra, Soham, the mantra emphasizes identity with the Absolute, and in some traditions is associated with the awakening of Kundalini. So the image of the swan, Hamsa, suggests not only freedom, but a mode of awareness participating in something unbounded. And Liber 65's swan behaves in a way that strongly fits such a symbol, silent, free, effortless, and uninterested in conceptual explanation. So, motion without destination becomes intelligible as the play of awareness within an infinite expanse in which there is nowhere else to arrive. The boy's questions then appear not childish in a merely condescending sense, but trapped in a framework that no longer applies. Under a Madhyamaka lens, the same passage becomes a dramatic miniature of emptiness analysis. The boy assumes that motion requires inherent origin, inherent destination, and inherent purpose. The adept's answers undercut that assumption without denying conventional appearance. The swan still moves, but its movement has no ultimate essence that can be captured by the categories of the questioning mind. The swan's silence is part of the teaching. Just like Madhyamaka reasoning, it does not replace one concept with another. It releases the mind from the compulsion to reify, to concretize the experience at all. And from the Kabbalistic side, the path is no longer experienced as the lower mind marching from point to point, but as free motion within the infinite across the abyss. The laughter of the adept expresses the relief of realizing that the conceptual framework itself was the trap. In all these readings, the central point remains the same. The passage suggests a mode of awareness that appears already freer than the questioning mind can produce through conceptual effort. The problem is not the absence of freedom. The problem is habitual interference. When the questions relax, the swan does not need to be forced into flight. It is already moving. And that is the beginning of a truly supernal sensibility, not control, but participation in a current already unfolding. And so here is our fourth and final meditation. So once again, get comfortable, take a few breaths. Allow your attention to relax completely. Do not focus on any single object. Let awareness remain open to whatever arises. Sounds, sensations, thoughts, and perceptions all appear within a wider field, the field of knowing. Instead of narrowing the mind, allow it to remain spacious and receptive. The knower is already free. Rest in that openness. And you can open your eyes again. Some traditions call this natural awareness, simply presence. At this point, the path is no longer experienced as laborious ascent, but as surrender to to a graceful current already transforming the aspirant from within. Our journey up the middle pillar now finds its completion in Kether, understood here as a non-dual point of origin, the smooth point. The parable of the dolphin and the harper can be read as symbolizing the culmination of this journey from the kingdom to the crown.
Behold, the abyss of the great deep. Therein is a mighty dolphin, lashing his sides with the force of the waves. There is also an harper of gold, playing infinite tunes. Then the dolphin delighted therein, and put off his body and became a bird. The harper also laid aside his harp, and played infinite tunes upon the panpipe. Then the bird desired exceedingly this bliss, and laying down its wings, became a fawn of the forest. The harper also laid down his panpipe, and with a human voice sang his infinite tunes. Then the fawn was enraptured, and followed far. At last, the harper was silent, and the fawn became Pan in the midst of the primal forest of eternity. Thou canst not charm the dolphin with silence, O my prophet.
The dolphin and the harper bring the sequence to completion. A restless creature of the sea is enchanted by music and drawn through successive transformations, from dolphin to bird to fawn to Pan. The sequence reads like an ascent through modes of being: aquatic immersion, aerial release, terrestrial ecstasy, and finally, all containing totality. The instruments change as the teaching deepens: a harp, a pipe, a voice, and finally silence. So the structure here can be read as both mythic and initiatory. The aspirant is educated, equilibrated, enraptured, and finally integrated. Kabbalistically, the current has completed what the earlier parables only prepared: the movement from fragmentation into a form of consciousness no longer centered in the separate personality. What began as a philosophical destabilization in Malkuth now culminates as a transformation of identity along the central current of the tree itself. The earlier stages can be associated with discipline, balance, knowledge, and the ordering of the faculties. The later stages culminate in the reconciliation of opposites under love and will, until the aspirant participates in what is symbolized as Pan, not as theatrical inflation, but as an image of totality. The prefix Pan, from the Greek meaning all, renders its object universal, signifying openness to everything, as in pansexual or pantheistic. Pan's name entered the English language as a signifier of the all, expressing a radical openness to everything. So here, individual identity is imagined as opening into a more total field of being. What mattered most, though, is the final silence. Instruction becomes unnecessary when realization is no longer a hand-me-down. The teacher falls silent because the student must now recognize rather than decode. The tree is no longer merely a map studied from below. It has become a living access of realization within consciousness itself. In comparative terms, this final parable can be read as converging with descriptions of the non-dual realization. The mind that once sought reality is no longer experienced as standing apart from it. Meditator, meditation, and object cease to stand apart. From a Jungian perspective, the ego reorganizes itself around a deeper center and eventually participates in psychic totality, integration, rather than the aggressively defending separateness. In thelemic language, the current is figured as completing itself. If we step back from the individual stories we've examined tonight, a pattern begins to come into focus. This is the structure that I discovered when I started mapping the recurring motifs in the text. That table is available as a PDF. If you'd like, you can scan this QR code. I'm going to show it again at the end, so you don't have to write it. But if you like, this will take you to a folder in my G drive. I put a bunch of PDFs there. And that table that we just saw, that's available there, so you can check it out when you want. There's a few other things, including the meditation and some other things we're about to discuss. I wanted to close this talk tonight with a few suggestions for ways to work with Liber 65 more directly in order to deepen your experience. And this, like I said, this is available in the QR code. I'm not going to read these all out to you right now, but you can check it out later. If we step back from the individual parables we've examined tonight, what emerges is that Liber 65 appears to be doing something very unusual. The book is not merely describing a spiritual path. Liber 65 can be understood as educating consciousness through symbol. Each image destabilizes the mental structure established by the previous one. The text progressively dismantles the way the mind tries to grasp reality until a different mode of awareness becomes possible. That mode is not reached in a single leap, but through a graduated path in which misconceptions and delusions are progressively undone. When we translate that initiatory arc into contemplative language, a very similar experience appears in traditions like Mahamudra, which investigates the nature of the mind through direct observation. First, appearances lose their naive solidity. Second, the mind is reorganized as constructing experience. Third, conceptual constructs become provisional vehicles that can lead toward direct realization. Fourth, attention turns toward awareness itself. Fifth, conceptual thought reaches its limit. Sixth, non-conceptual awareness begins to emerge. And finally, that recognition stabilizes until awareness and appearance are no longer experienced as separate. This does not mean that all traditions are secretly the same, nor that their doctrines should be collapsed into one another, but it does suggest something interesting. When different contemplative traditions investigate consciousness deeply enough, they often encounter remarkably similar transformations in how the mind experiences itself and the world. The Tree of Life provides one symbolic architecture for that movement. Mahamudra provides another. Alchemy provides another. And Liber 65 expresses that same transformation through mythic imagery. This is why the book speaks in what the alchemists called the language of the birds. What I've tried to show tonight is only one arc drawn from a small portion of the text, only one workable entry point into a book whose symbolic density far exceeds anything a single talk could exhaust. Carl Jung made a useful distinction that helps clarify what is happening here. A sign points to something already known and definable. It is a conventional marker that refers to a fixed meaning. A symbol, by contrast, expresses something that cannot yet be fully articulated. It points beyond the limits of conceptual thought toward a deeper reality the conscious mind can only approach indirectly. A true symbol is therefore never exhausted by explanation. It continues to unfold meaning as consciousness develops. Seen in this light, the heart surrounded by a serpent, the opening image and title of the book, becomes the perfect emblem of the whole work, a hidden center of consciousness encircled by transformative force. The parables do not merely explain that force, they allow the reader to encounter it. And that may be why the holy books were delivered in this strange symbolic form. Symbolic language does not simply communicate ideas, it provokes recognition. Liber 65 is therefore more than just a book. It is itself an initiation. And as I mentioned, this QR code will take you to a folder. It has that table of ascent. It has the meditations and the suggestions of way to engage. And there's also a link to a YouTube video of my previous talk on Liber 65, where I explore the structure and the relationship of the book to the attaining knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. So you can check out all sorts of stuff there. Thank you. Now you see it.